They think I am just a boring housewife who keeps dinner warm while her husband claims to be building an empire. Derek and his snobbish family see a compliant woman, but they forget that before I married him, I hunted dirty money for ghost corporations. So when my husband told me not to wait up tonight, he had no idea I was not waiting. I was meticulously observing every single move that would lead to his absolute ruin. My name is Elena. To the outside world, and specifically to the people sitting around the mahogany dining table in front of me, I am a 34-year-old administrative accountant who enjoys knitting and silence. I am the woman who files tax returns for small bakeries and gets excited about a 2% coupon at the grocery store. What none of them know, especially my husband Derek, is that my title of administrative accountant is a convenient cover. In reality, I am the head of financial risk investigation at Vanguard Solutions, a private security firm that corporations hire when they suspect their CFO is funneling millions into offshore accounts. I spend my days tracing digital footprints that people think they have erased, and I can spot a shell company from a single balance sheet discrepancy. However, here at the Prescott family estate, my skills are considered non-existent. The Prescotts are old Boston money, the kind of family that measures human worth by how many summers one has spent in the Hamptons and how frequently one's face graces the society pages of the local glossies. To them, I am an anomaly, a glitch in their pristine lineage. My mother-in-law, Victoria Prescott, makes sure I never forget this. She is a woman of steel wrapped in cashmere, a master of the backhanded compliment. She often smiles at me over her crystal wine glass and tells the table how refreshing it is that Derek chose someone so simple and safe, implying that I am the human equivalent of beige paint. Derek, the man I married 3 years ago, sat across from me, swirling a glass of vintage red wine. He calls himself an entrepreneur, a title that seems to mostly involve spending the allowance from his family trust fund on startup ventures that never quite start. He loves the aesthetics of business. He loves the suits, the handshakes, and the expensive lunches. The actual work of profit and loss is something he finds tedious. Sunday dinners at the Prescott house are less about family bonding and more about psychological warfare. I am routinely excluded from the conversations about investments and market trends. They assume the concepts are too high-minded for a woman who, in their eyes, counts pennies for a living. I usually sit in silence, cutting my roast beef, while Victoria reminisces about Derek's past girlfriends. She loves to mention the leggy models or the daughters of oil tycoons, lamenting how busy they must be running empires or walking runways. Unlike me, who always has so much free time, I take these insults without flinching. They mistake my silence for submission, but it is not. It is data collection. I watch how Derek carelessly orders a $3,000 bottle of wine when he claimed last week that cash flow was tight. I listen to the buzzwords he uses to describe his business models, noting that they are heavy on jargon and completely empty of substance. I am not just a wife at that table. I am an auditor in enemy territory. Recently, the atmosphere had shifted. Derek began talking about a massive new project that was going to change everything. Along with this excitement came the red flags. He started coming home well past 11 at night, claiming he was in strategy meetings. He guarded his phone with a paranoia that screamed guilty conscience, flipping it face down the second he walked into a room. I checked our joint account one Tuesday afternoon and noticed a withdrawal of $5,000. When I asked him about it, he waved his hand dismissively and told me it was a necessary networking expense. He said you have to spend money to make money. The breaking point of my patience came tonight. I asked him a simple question about the revenue projections for this new venture, purely out of professional curiosity disguised as wifely interest. Derek laughed, a cold and condescending sound that echoed in our kitchen. He looked at me with pity and said that I should just worry about keeping the stove clean. He told me that billion-dollar conversations were not meant for a mind that only understands small change. He turned his back on me, unaware that the mind he just insulted had already begun building the case that would destroy him. It was a Tuesday evening when the shift in the atmosphere became undeniable. Derek stood by the front door adjusting his cufflinks, wearing the bespoke Italian suit that had cost $4,000. The air around him was thick with a cologne that smelled of sandalwood and musk, applied far too heavily for a standard business meeting. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing back his hair with a nervous energy that did not match his words. He told me that he was meeting a strategic partner and the negotiations would likely run late into the night. Then he looked at me and delivered the line that would seal his fate. He said, "Do not wait up." I did not argue. I did not ask who the partner was or why a meeting required such formal attire. I simply nodded and told him to drive safely, playing the role of the trusting, oblivious wife to perfection. However, the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut and the aggressive roar of his engine faded down the driveway, my posture changed. The submissive slump vanished, replaced by the rigid focus I utilized every day at Vanguard Solutions. I did not go to the kitchen to clean up. I walked straight to my home office. Because my name was co-signed on several of his liquidity loans, a fact he often conveniently forgot when he was not begging for a signature, I had legal and unrestricted access to the transaction feeds of our joint assets. I bypassed the standard banking interface and pulled up the raw data stream on my secure monitor. He was not in a boardroom. The GPS tag and the transaction authorization code placed him at Le Jardin, a five-star French restaurant known for its intimate candlelight and prix-fixe menus, not its whiteboard strategy sessions. He had just authorized a charge of $600 for champagne. 2 days later, I met the reason for the champagne. Derek brought her to Sunday dinner at the Prescott estate, introducing her as Monica, his new senior investment advisor. She was undeniably attractive, dressed in a sharp blazer that was cut just a little too low for a business setting. She walked into the dining room with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the family was instantly captivated. Monica spent the evening dazzling my in-laws with a rapid-fire stream of corporate buzzwords. She talked about synergy, vertical integration, and paradigm shifts. To anyone who actually worked in finance, her sentences were hollow nonsense, but to the Prescotts, it sounded like brilliance. Derek and Monica sat next to each other, and I watched as their knees brushed against one another under the table. They exchanged lingering looks that were far too intimate for business partners, laughing too loudly at each other's jokes while I sat in silence at the end of the table. Then, Monica turned her predator gaze toward me. She smiled, a gesture that did not reach her eyes, and asked if I understood what they were discussing. She said she assumed I was not used to hearing about high-level corporate mergers. She said my administrative job must be very nice and stable, making the word stable sound like a terminal disease. I did not snap back. I did not defend my intelligence. I simply took a sip of water and offered a tight, enigmatic smile. My eyes, however, were locked on her left wrist. She was wearing a vintage gold Cartier tank watch. I recognized it immediately because I had seen the charge for $8,000 on Derek's secondary credit card statement just 3 days ago. He had categorized the expense as office equipment. Derek saw my silence and took it as an opportunity to pile on. He sighed loudly and told the table that he wished I had even half of Monica's business acumen. He said it would make his life so much easier if he had a partner who could keep up with his vision. That was the moment the investigation truly began. I was done merely tracking expenses. That night, while Derek slept off his wine, I logged into my secure server at Vanguard Solutions. I needed to know exactly who Monica was, and I was going to tear apart their so-called breakthrough business model brick by brick to find the rot underneath. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the room as I accessed the deepest layers of the Vanguard Solutions database. It did not take long to dismantle the carefully constructed persona of Monica Vance. The woman dazzling my in-laws was a ghost. Her social security number belonged to a deceased woman from Ohio, and her previous employment records were elaborate fabrications. Her real name was Jessica Miller, a career con artist who had legally changed her name 3 times in the last decade. Her specialty was not corporate restructuring. It was finding wealthy, gullible men with something to prove and bleeding them dry before vanishing into the wind. While I was uncovering her criminal history, Derek was becoming a ghost in his own home. He stopped coming home for dinner entirely, claiming that he and Monica were on an aggressive capital-raising tour. He left me to attend the endless stream of Prescott family galas and charity auctions alone, forcing me to make awkward excuses for his absence. Victoria noticed, but instead of blaming her son, she turned her cold shoulder toward me. She began making pointed comments over tea, suggesting that Derek finally had a partner who matched his ambition. She insinuated that Monica was the kind of woman who belonged in the Prescott orbit, unlike me, who she still viewed as a dull clerical error in her son's life. The situation escalated from emotional betrayal to financial crime on a Thursday morning. I discovered a digital folder on our shared cloud drive that Derek thought he had hidden. Inside were scanned documents for a second mortgage on our home. He had forged my signature on the deed, leveraging the only asset I truly cared about to pour liquidity into Monica's phantom project. He was willing to make us homeless to fund a lie. That evening, Derek came home drunk on success and expensive scotch. He passed out on the sofa, his phone slipping from his hand onto the rug. I picked it up. The passcode had not changed. What I found in his text messages was not just evidence of a physical affair, but a detailed blueprint for theft. They were not just planning to run away together. They were plotting to drain the Prescott family trust. One message from Monica read that once his parents signed the transfer for the seed money, they would book tickets to the Caymans and leave the mess behind. A younger, weaker version of myself might have woken him up and screamed. I might have thrown the phone at him and demanded a divorce right there. But I was not that woman. I was a forensic auditor. I sat calmly at my desk and connected his phone to my laptop. I downloaded every text message, every photo, and every location log. I recorded the voice memos where they mocked his parents for being easy targets. I took screenshots of the forged mortgage papers and the transfer requests. The next day, I met with a former colleague from Vanguard in a quiet coffee shop far from the financial district. He reviewed the dossier I had compiled and confirmed that I had enough evidence to put them both in federal prison for a very long time. He asked me if I wanted to call the authorities immediately. I told him no. Derek and Monica were in the final stages of their long con. They were pressuring Victoria and my father-in-law to invest heavily in a venture they called Infinity Horizons. It was a shell company with a flashy website and zero assets. I decided to give Victoria one last chance. I approached her in the garden room, keeping my voice low and respectful. I suggested that she should have an independent team vet Monica's background before transferring any funds. Victoria looked at me with absolute disgust. She laughed and told me that my jealousy was showing. She said it was pathetic that I could not handle my husband having a female business partner who was actually successful. She told me to stop trying to sabotage Derek's moment of glory. That was the moment my conscience cleared. I had tried. Now, I was done protecting them. I decided I would not stop the transaction. I would let Derek and Monica believe they had won. I would let them climb to the absolute peak of their arrogance, right up until the pen hovered over the check, and then I would push them off. The Prescott Family Company Anniversary Gala was always a spectacle of excessive wealth. But this year, the opulence felt particularly suffocating. The ballroom was decorated with thousands of white orchids, and the air hummed with the sound of a string quartet playing softly in the corner. The seating chart, usually a mundane logistical detail, had been weaponized to make a public statement about my standing in the family. Derek and Monica were seated at the head table, flanked by his parents and the most influential board members. They looked like royalty holding court. I, on the other hand, had been placed at a small, round table near the swinging double doors of the kitchen. It was the spot usually reserved for distant cousins or last-minute additions, a place where the clatter of silverware and the smell of reheating sauce made conversation impossible. It was a deliberate, public humiliation intended to show everyone exactly where I ranked in the new hierarchy. Derek stood up to give his speech, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute to silence the room. He looked the part of the successful heir, his face flushed with the intoxication of attention. He spoke passionately about a new vision for the family legacy, using grand words that meant nothing. He gestured to Monica. introducing her not just as an advisor, but as the future co-founder of their new enterprise. The room erupted in polite applause. Monica beamed, playing the role of the humble genius perfectly. She then presented my in-laws with gifts that she claimed were tokens of her gratitude. She gave my father-in-law a vintage watch and my mother-in-law a diamond brooch. The room gasped at her generosity, but I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I knew exactly which account had paid for those gifts. She was buying their affection with their own son's stolen money. The toasts began, and glass after glass was raised to the golden couple. I sat in my exile by the kitchen, invisible to the people who were supposedly my family. During a lull in the service, Monica glided across the room toward me. To the observers, it looked like a gracious gesture, a kind woman checking on the isolated wife. Up close, her eyes were hard and predatory. She leaned down, bringing her lips close to my ear so that only I could hear her. She whispered that I should start packing my bags soon. She told me that Derek needed a wife who was worthy of an empire, not a glorified secretary who bored him to death. I did not recoil. I finished chewing a bite of my cold salmon, took a slow sip of wine, and looked her up and down. I smiled pleasantly and told her to be careful with the hem of her dress. I said that first-class fakes usually unravel very easily. Monica went pale. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, dismissing my comment with a scoff. She clearly thought I was just lashing out in jealous desperation. She walked away, swaying her hips, confident that she had won. The evening reached its crescendo when my father-in-law, Mr. Prescott, stood up again. He was swept away by the adoration and the promise of even more wealth. He announced to the room that he was so inspired by Derek and Monica's vision that he was not going to wait for the lawyers to draft the paperwork next week. He declared that he would sign the seed investment check for $5 million right there at the table to demonstrate his absolute faith in them. The crowd cheered, but my blood ran cold. This was it. They were about to sign away their retirement, their legacy, and their security to a pair of thieves. Despite how cruel Victoria had been to me, and despite how weak Mr. Prescott was, I could not sit back and watch them be destroyed. I was a professional, and I had a duty to the truth. I pushed my chair back and prepared to ruin the party. The moment my father-in-law's gold fountain pen touched the fiber of the check, I moved. I pushed my chair back with a deliberate force that sent a screeching, metallic sound tearing through the polite silence of the banquet hall. Every head turned toward the back corner where I had been banished near the kitchen doors. I did not look down, nor did I apologize. I squared my shoulders and walked toward the head table with a stride I usually saved for federal courtrooms. "Wait," I said. My voice was not the soft, accommodating whisper they were used to hearing over Sunday pot roast. It was sharp, authoritative, and it carried across the large room without the need for a microphone. "Before you sign that check, I think you should review this due diligence report." Derek shot up from his seat, his face turning a blotchy shade of red that matched the wine in his glass. He shouted at me, demanding to know what the hell I was doing. He told me to sit down immediately and stop embarrassing him in front of their distinguished guests. He looked at me with a mixture of panic and fury, expecting me to shrink back into the shadows as I always had whenever he raised his voice. I ignored him completely, treating his outburst like background noise. I reached into my oversized tote bag and pulled out a thick, spiral-bound dossier. The bright red security stamp of Vanguard Solutions was clearly visible on the cover. I tossed it onto the center of the table with a heavy thud. It slid across the starched white tablecloth, knocking over a crystal salt shaker before coming to a rest directly in front of Mr. Prescott. The bold black lettering on the cover was impossible to miss. It read, "Financial Fraud Investigation Report regarding Project Infinity Horizons and individual Monica Vance." The room fell into a deathly silence. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. Victoria looked from the file to me, her brow furrowed in confusion and distaste. She asked what kind of sick joke this was. I did not need to look at the file to answer her. I had memorized every line of data in it. I addressed the table with the cold detachment of a senior auditor delivering a verdict. I stated that Infinity Horizons did not possess a valid business license in any state. I explained that the address listed on their investment prospectus was not a high-rise office building, but a condemned warehouse in Nevada that had been abandoned since 2010. Monica jumped to her feet, knocking her chair over in the process. She screamed that I was lying and that I was crazy, but her voice cracked on the last word. The composure she had maintained all evening was fracturing. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. I turned my gaze slowly toward her, dissecting her panic. I told her that her name was not Monica Vance. I said that her legal name was Jessica Miller and that she was currently wanted in 3 states for wire fraud, identity theft, and impersonating a financial advisor. Before she could scream again, I pulled a small remote control from my pocket. Earlier that evening, I had tipped a waiter $200 to connect my tablet to the room's projection system, telling him I had a surprise slideshow for the family. I pressed the button. The large screen behind the head table, which had been displaying a loop of the Prescott family crest, flickered and changed. A massive, high-resolution police mugshot of Monica, holding a placard with the name Jessica Miller, appeared for the entire room to see. Her hair was messy and her makeup was smeared in the photo, but the face was unmistakably the woman standing in the designer gown next to my husband. The image on the projection screen shifted instantly from the mugshot to a complex web of bank statements and wire transfers. I pointed the laser clicker at the highlighted columns, dissecting the numbers with clinical precision. I explained to the stunned audience that the luxury lifestyle Monica displayed was not funded by her business acumen, but by the systematic looting of the Prescott Family Trust. I traced the lines on the screen, showing exactly how Derek had disguised withdrawals as capital improvements and consulting fees, funneling tens of thousands of dollars directly into Monica's personal accounts to pay for her lease and her wardrobe. I turned to face the room, addressing the board members who had looked down on me for years. I said that Derek liked to tell everyone he was an investment genius. The silence in the room was heavy as I delivered the reality check. I revealed that in actual fact, he had lost $400,000 in the last 6 months alone attempting to play the futures market. I explained that he was currently using his parents' liquidity to frantically plug the holes in a sinking ship. Derek snapped. The humiliation was too much for his fragile ego. He lunged across the space between the head table and the podium, his face twisted in rage, reaching out to snatch the remote control from my hand. He never made it. A large man in a dark suit stepped out from the shadows near the curtain. He was one of the private security contractors I had hired specifically for this event. He intercepted Derek effortlessly, blocking his path and restraining him with a firm grip on his shoulder. Derek struggled, but he was physically outmatched, forced to stand there and watch the rest of his execution. At the table, Mr. Prescott was ignoring the commotion. He was entirely focused on the dossier I had slid in front of him. His hands were trembling violently as he flipped through the pages. He had reached the section containing the wire transfer authorizations. He was staring at his own signature at the bottom of documents he had never seen before. The realization that his own son had forged his name to steal from him was visible on his face, turning his complexion a sickly shade of gray. I decided it was time to pivot from financial ruin to personal devastation. I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen changed from spreadsheets to a timeline of text messages and a map view overlaid with GPS data points. I looked directly at Derek, who was still panting against the restraint of the bodyguard. I reminded him of the nights he came home late, smelling of cologne and lies. I quoted his own words back to him. I looked him in the eye and said, "You told me not to wait up." My tone dripped with irony as I continued. I told him that I did not wait. Instead, I watched. I pointed to the screen where a red dot was clustering repeatedly at a specific location on the map. I explained that I had tracked his phone location every single night he claimed to be in a shareholder meeting. The location was not an office tower. It was the Ritz-Carlton. The final slide clicked into place. These were high-resolution photographs taken with a telephoto lens by a private investigator I kept on retainer. They showed Derek and Monica in the hotel lobby, embracing and kissing with a passion that left no room for interpretation. Victoria Prescott let out a strangled sob and collapsed back into her chair. She looked at her son as if he were a stranger, her eyes wide with shock and absolute disappointment. The illusion of her perfect, morally superior family had been shattered in front of all her friends and rivals. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Monica had grabbed her designer clutch and was attempting to slide discreetly toward the rear service exit, hoping to vanish while the room was fixated on the scandal. I spoke into the microphone one last time, my voice amplifying through the hall. I told her not to be in such a rush. I announced that the Economic Crimes Unit was currently waiting at the main entrance. I informed her that I had emailed the full evidence package to the district attorney at 8 o'clock that morning. The doors were closed, and her game was over, cornered like a rat and held firmly in place by the security guard. Derek decided to play his last desperate card. He did not apologize. Instead, he looked at me with eyes full of misplaced blame and shouted that this was all my fault. He claimed that if I had been a good wife, a wife who knew how to share and support her husband, he never would have had to seek comfort in the arms of another woman. He tried to paint himself as the victim of a cold marriage rather than the perpetrator of a majestic fraud. The room did not buy it. The elite of Boston society stared at him with open pity and revulsion. His weak defense only highlighted how truly small and cowardly he was. He was a man-child in a tuxedo, throwing a tantrum because he had been caught stealing from his own parents. I started to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh, but a genuine, deep sound of absolute contempt that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I walked closer to him, looking down at the man I had wasted 3 years on. I told him that he was not looking for a partner to share his life with. I said he was looking for someone to stroke his fragile ego and validate his delusions of grandeur. I told him that I was far too busy running million-dollar investigations to waste my energy pretending to admire his incompetence. The confusion on his face was satisfying, so I decided to twist the knife. For the first time, I dropped my cover completely. I announced to the room that I was not just an administrative accountant. I revealed that I am the vice president of financial risk at Vanguard Solutions. I told Derek clearly that my annual income is 3 times what he receives from his trust fund allowance. I explained that I stayed in this marriage because I respected the vows I took, not because I needed a single cent of his family's money. Victoria looked as if she had been slapped. Her mouth hung open, ruining her carefully composed facade. She stammered, asking why I had never told them that I was a high-level executive. I turned my gaze to her, my expression flat. I told her that the answer was simple. I said she never asked. I reminded her that in 3 years, her only questions to me were about whether my dress was from the latest season or if I had gained weight. At that moment, the heavy double doors swung open again. Uniformed officers from the Economic Crimes Unit marched into the ballroom. They walked straight to Monica, who was still trying to blend into the catering staff. They pulled her arms behind her back and slapped handcuffs on her wrists in front of the entire assembly. The click of the metal was audible over the whispers of the crowd. Derek panicked. He turned to his father, his voice cracking as he begged for help. He called out to his dad, pleading for him to fix this. Mr. Prescott did not even look at him. He turned his back on his son and stared at the wall. He stated coldly that he did not have a son who was this stupid and deceitful. The final humiliation for Derek came from his soulmate. As the officers led Monica away, she started screaming. She was not screaming for a lawyer. She was screaming that Derek was the mastermind. She yelled that he knew everything and that she would testify against him if they gave her a deal. She threw him to the wolves without a second of hesitation. I looked at Derek one last time. He was weeping now, a broken man with no allies left. I reached for my left hand and slid the diamond wedding ring off my finger. It felt heavy and cold. I placed it gently on top of the thick evidence file that lay on the table. I told him to take it back. I said that the ring was just as fake as his love had been. Then, I turned away. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had turned suffocating. The polite silence of the upper crust had completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic buzzing of gossip. Everywhere I looked, I saw smartphones raised in the air, recording the destruction of the Prescott reputation for the world to see. I stood there amidst the wreckage of their dignity and calmly collected my personal belongings. My hands were steady as I closed the clasp of my purse. There were no tears in my eyes and no tremor in my voice. I was done processing emotions. I was strictly processing data now. Victoria Prescott, seeing her world crumble and realizing she had bet on the wrong horse, tried to salvage the unsalvageable. She stepped over the cables of the projector and reached out to take my hand, her face twisted into a mask of pleading desperation. She called me her darling and asked if we could just sit down and talk. She said she was so sorry for the terrible misunderstanding between us. I jerked my hand away as if her touch were corrosive. I looked her dead in the eye and told her not to call me darling. I used her formal name, Mrs. Prescott, to drive the wedge deeper. I told her that she was not sorry for how she treated me. I told her she was only apologizing because I had just saved her entire net worth from being stolen, and because she just found out I was wealthier than she ever imagined. I swept my gaze across the room, looking at my father-in-law who was still staring at the forged checks, and then back to Victoria. I told them that their family was nothing but a circus decorated in gold leaf. I said that I had bought a ticket and watched the entire performance, but now I wanted a refund. Derek, who was still standing near the podium looking like a child who had lost his mother, started screaming in panic. He yelled that I could not leave him right now. He screamed that he was going to be sued and that he would be bankrupt by the end of the week. I stopped walking and turned my head slightly to address him one last time. I told him that his bankruptcy was his problem. I said that since he loved playing the role of the big businessman, I would give him his first real lesson in risk management. I told him that the #1 rule is to never make an enemy of your own auditor. I informed him that my attorney would be contacting him first thing tomorrow morning to handle the divorce proceedings and the division of assets. I clarified that I would be taking back everything that legally belonged to me. As I made my way to the exit, I passed the waiter who had helped me set up the projector. He looked terrified but impressed. I stopped and pressed a crisp $100 bill into his hand. I thanked him for his assistance and told him he did a great job. Then I pushed open the heavy double doors of the manor. I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the sounds of sobbing, shouting, and the approaching wail of police sirens behind me. I did not look back. The night air hit my face, sharp and cold, but it did not make me shiver. Instead, it felt like a cleansing wave washing away 3 years of accumulated grime. I walked across the gravel parking lot, listening to the crunch of stones under my heels. I expected to feel a pang of loss. I expected to feel the hollow ache that usually accompanies the end of a marriage. But as I stood there in the darkness, taking a deep breath of the crisp oxygen, I realized that the only thing I felt was an overwhelming lightness. It was as if I had been carrying a boulder on my back for over 1,000 days, and I had finally shrugged it off. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen was bright against the dark. I opened my contact list and found Derek's name. Without a second of hesitation, I tapped the block contact button. Then I did the same for Victoria, then Mr. Prescott, and then every single cousin and aunt who had ever looked down their nose at me at a family barbecue. With a few simple swipes of my thumb, I erased them from my digital existence. They no longer had access to me. A notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. It was a secure message from my director at Vanguard Solutions. He wrote that I had done excellent work. He confirmed that the FBI had officially taken custody of the Miller case file and that the evidence was airtight. He asked if I wanted to take a few days of administrative leave to process everything. I typed my reply immediately. I told him that I did not need any time off. I said I would be in the office early tomorrow morning because there were plenty of other scammers out there who needed to be caught. I walked past the sensible mid-range sedan I had driven for the duration of my marriage to avoid bruising Derek's fragile ego. I headed toward the far corner of the lot, where the valet had parked my actual car. It was a sleek, slate-gray sports coupe with 400 horsepower, a vehicle I had bought with my own bonus check 2 years ago and kept in storage, only bringing it out when I knew the Prescotts would not be watching. I unlocked the door and slid into the leather driver's seat. It fit me perfectly, unlike the life I had just left behind. I adjusted the rearview mirror. Through the back window, I could see the chaotic scene unfolding at the entrance of the manor. The strobe lights of the police cruisers cut through the night, painting the white pillars of the house in flashes of red and blue. I watched as 2 officers guided Monica into the back of a patrol car. Derek was standing on the steps, looking small and lost, staring into the void where his future used to be. For a brief moment, the memories flooded back. I remembered the way Victoria would sigh whenever I spoke. I remembered the silent dinners where I was treated like furniture. I remembered Derek telling me I was not smart enough to understand his business. Those moments used to sting, but now they felt like scenes from a boring movie I had finished watching. They held no power over me anymore. All the insults and the isolation were just noise that had finally been silenced. I realized then that I had executed the perfect revenge. I had not screamed or fought or stooped to their level. I had simply handed them the truth and watched them choke on it. The sweetest victory was not in destroying them myself, but in letting their own greed and arrogance be the architects of their downfall. They were in ruins, but I was still standing. I was whole. I was wealthy, and I was absolutely brilliant. I pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive growl that vibrated through the chassis. It sounded like power. It sounded like freedom. I shifted into gear and pressed down on the accelerator. I steered the car out of the estate gates, leaving the manicured lawns and the fake smiles in the dust. I turned onto the main highway, heading toward the glowing skyline of the city in the distance. That was where I belonged. That was where my real life was waiting for me. By the time the sun rose over the Boston skyline the next morning, the Prescott family name was trending on every major social media platform, but it was certainly not for the reasons they would have liked. The headlines were brutal and unrelenting. They plastered Monica's mugshot next to Derek's terrified face from the party, dubbing them the Bonnie and Clyde of the boardroom. The prestigious reputation that the Prescotts had spent generations cultivating was evaporating by the hour. I checked the financial news on my tablet and saw that the stock price for Prescott Enterprises had plummeted 30% since the opening bell. Investors were fleeing a sinking ship, terrified by the revelation that the heir to the company was involved in massive fraud. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my office on the 40th floor of the Vanguard Solutions building. The city looked different from up here. It was small, manageable, and orderly. I took a slow sip of my hot black coffee, savoring the bitterness and the silence. For the first time in 3 years, I did not have to worry about pleasing anyone but myself. My desk phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was my lawyer. He sounded almost bored as he relayed the news. Derek had signed the divorce papers at 6 o'clock that morning. He was in a state of absolute panic, terrified that I might have held back more evidence that could increase his prison sentence. He had agreed to every single term without negotiation. He did not fight for the house, the cars, or the joint accounts. He just wanted me to go away. I told my lawyer that I accepted the terms. I did not ask for alimony. I did not need their money. I had my own career, my own millions, and my own dignity. I was keeping the penthouse apartment I had purchased with my own earnings before the marriage, the one asset I had wisely kept in a separate trust. That was all I needed. Just as I hung up the phone, my assistant walked in carrying a massive arrangement of rare white orchids. They were beautiful, expensive, and completely desperate. She placed them on my desk and handed me a heavy cream-colored envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Victoria. I opened the flap and pulled out the card. It was a frantic, scribbled mess begging for a meeting, asking me to reconsider and pleading for family unity in this difficult time. I did not finish reading it. I walked over to the shredder in the corner of the room and fed the heavy card into the slot. The machine whirred to life, and the sound of the thick paper being ground into confetti was more satisfying than any symphony I had ever heard. I watched the strips of paper fall into the bin, carrying the last desperate gasps of the Prescott matriarch with them. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. I opened a fresh file on my computer. It was a new case involving a tech startup in Silicon Valley that was cooking its books. The world was full of liars and thieves, and as long as they existed, I would have work to do. Life did not stop just because a marriage ended. In fact, my life was just restarting. They told me not to wait up, and I did not wait. I walked through that door. I locked it from the outside, and I threw away the key. Goodbye, Prescott's. I smiled at my reflection in the dark computer screen, typed in my password, and got back to work. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below with your city or country so we can connect. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so this story can reach even more people.